When Victor Green and his HOA tried to steal Jacob Lawson's lakefront to build 120 luxury cabins, they forgot one thing: Jacob owned the dam. What happened next drained more than just the water, it destroyed their entire empire. Stay tuned, because by the end of this story, you'll see exactly how one man turned the tables. And if you love real stories of power, greed, and revenge, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is one you won't forget. I had always thought of the lake as more than just a backdrop to my home. It was the heartbeat of my life. My little cabin sat right on the shore, the wooden deck stretching out toward the calm water like it had been placed there by nature itself. In the mornings, mist would curl and drift over the surface, soft and ghostly, as the first rays of sunlight touched it. I'd stand there barefoot, a mug of coffee in my hand, feeling the cool planks under my feet and listening to the gentle slap of water against the dock. This was my peace. This was my rhythm. It wasn't a public lake. Only a few of us owned land around it, and we took pride in keeping it that way. There was no marina, no jet ski rental stand, no noisy tourist crowd in the summer. Just the slow sound of oars dipping in the water, the occasional laughter of neighbors' kids swimming in July, and the distant cry of a loon at dusk. The kind of place you didn't think still existed. The dam that kept the lake here wasn't some city project, it was family. My grandfather had built it back in the 1960s with his own hands and a small crew of locals. They'd poured sweat, time, and their own money into it, all for the purpose of creating a shared resource for the handful of families who lived nearby. It was more than just a wall holding back water, it was a promise. Over the years, my family paid for maintenance, repairs, inspections. When I inherited the cabin, I also inherited the paperwork. The original deed, the water rights, and the dam registration, all in my family's name. That dam was the reason the lake existed. Without it, this peaceful body of water would just be a slow, winding creek. And while we shared access with the other landowners, everyone knew, at least until recently, that it was my family who kept the lake alive. Life here followed the seasons. In spring, the water would swell with snowmelt, and wildflowers would paint the banks with color. Summer brought fishing trips, late-night bonfires, and the smell of pine needles baking in the sun. Autumn turned the hills into a patchwork quilt of gold and crimson, and the lake mirrored every leaf like a painting. Winter was my favorite: thick ice, quiet snow, and a silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. It was a place that kept the chaos of the outside world at arm's length. The nearest grocery store was 20 minutes away, and the nearest traffic light was even farther. That suited me just fine. I didn't move here to be close to convenience. I moved here to be close to peace. But peace has a way of drawing the wrong kind of attention. And I didn't know it then, but the quiet life I had built here was about to be shattered by people who saw the lake not as a sanctuary, but as a gold mine. People who didn't care about the history, the rights, or the years of stewardship that had kept this place alive. People who believed they could simply take what they wanted. Victor Green showed up one bright spring morning like he was stepping off the cover of a business magazine. Slick suit, polished shoes, and a smile that felt rehearsed. He introduced himself as the newly elected president of the homeowners association that had recently formed after a big chunk of land on the opposite shore was bought by a developer. His handshake was firm, his words smooth, and his tone carried the weight of someone who expected people to agree with him before he even finished speaking. He didn't waste time on small talk. Instead, he launched into a polished pitch about unlocking the potential of the lakefront. The plan sounded like something out of a real estate ad: 120 luxury vacation cabins, each with private docks, fire pits, and floor-to-ceiling windows to capture the pristine beauty of the water. He painted a picture of an exclusive community where wealthy buyers would flock from all over the country, filling the air with the sound of champagne corks and the scent of catered meals. He promised a surge in property values, a world-class atmosphere, and an upgraded shoreline. I listened, leaning against my dock post, watching him like you watch a salesman you know is leaving something out. I reminded him, politely at first, that this wasn't some unclaimed piece of wilderness. The lake wasn't theirs to develop. They didn't have the water rights, and the dam was privately owned. His smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker in his eyes, like he'd just heard a mosquito buzz in his ear. He brushed it off with a laugh, saying something about community resources belonging to everyone and how the law was on their side. 2 weeks later, I woke to the growl of engines and the crash of heavy machinery. When I stepped outside, I saw bulldozers tearing up my shoreline. Men in neon vests and hard hats were driving stakes into the ground, marking out plots. And there was Victor, standing off to the side with a clipboard, sipping a lot like he was supervising an art project. I walked right up to him, told him he was trespassing. He didn't even look offended. He just told me this was part of a community improvement project, and that I'd be thanking him once I saw how much my property value went up. I told him property value wasn't why I lived here. He smirked, said something about sentimentality being bad for business, and turned back to his clipboard. That was the moment I understood this wasn't just about building cabins. This was about control. Victor and his HOA didn't see a lake, they saw a profit margin. They thought if they moved fast enough, I'd be too overwhelmed, too outnumbered, or too broke to stop them. They were wrong. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I went back inside, pulled out my grandfather's files, and started reading. If they wanted to play this game, I was going to make sure they had no idea just how badly they'd miscalculated. The next few months turned my quiet stretch of lakefront into something unrecognizable. The sounds of loons and lapping water were replaced by the constant roar of generators, the beeping of reversing trucks, and the metallic clang of hammers. Massive piles of lumber appeared where open shoreline used to be. Concrete mixers churned through the night, pouring foundations for cabins I had never agreed to. The smell of pine and fresh air was drowned out by exhaust fumes and the stench of wet cement. They didn't just build, they claimed. The HOA fenced off entire sections of shoreline, driving posts right into the sand like they were staking a flag in conquered territory. They set up signs that read, "Private dock, residents only," and in smaller print, "Violators will be prosecuted." I stood there one afternoon reading one of those signs, my boots in the dirt of my own property, and felt a cold kind of anger settle in. They even had the nerve to post "no fishing" notices in the shallows where I'd been casting lines since I was a kid. The HOA's version of the lake wasn't for living, wasn't for enjoying, it was for selling. They were marketing it to wealthy out-of-state buyers, pushing glossy brochures that showed couples drinking wine on pristine decks, kids laughing on paddleboards, and perfectly staged sunsets. It was all a lie. I learned through a neighbor that the cabins were going for $500,000 each, and the first 20 had already been sold before the foundations were even poured. Victor and his board held community meetings in the new clubhouse, but I never received an invitation. The few locals who went told me the tone was smug and dismissive, as if anyone questioning their plan was standing in the way of progress. They didn't own the water. They didn't own the dam. But they acted as though both were theirs by divine right. When I confronted Victor again, he waved a stack of legal documents in my face, claiming permits, zoning approvals, and environmental clearances. I knew enough to recognize half of it as smoke and mirrors, paper meant to intimidate, not to stand up in court. Every day I kept working on my land like normal, but I was watching. I took photos of every fence post, every private property sign, every inch of shoreline they altered. I logged dates and times. I mapped out exactly where their so-called improvements crossed into my boundaries. All the while, the HOA was so wrapped up in their construction schedules and sales pitches that they never stopped to consider the one thing holding their entire dream together. Without the lake, they had nothing. And the lake only existed because of the dam, my dam. The one piece of this puzzle they couldn't touch, buy, or bully their way into owning. They were building their empire on water they didn't control. They just hadn't realized yet that I was willing to remind them exactly what that meant. By midsummer, the transformation of the lake was almost complete, at least from the HOA's perspective. What had once been a quiet retreat was now a glossy, high-end development they were calling Lake Mirage. 80% of the cabins were finished, their fresh cedar siding glowing in the sun. Docks jutted out into the water like polished fingers, and manicured lawns replaced the wild grasses that used to grow along the banks. Real estate agents in sunglasses guided prospective buyers along the shoreline, handing out champagne flutes and brochures that promised exclusive lakefront living. Buyers arrived in shiny SUVs and luxury sedans, snapping photos and marveling at the view. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing aerial footage of the glittering blue water. Music drifted across the lake from an outdoor sound system. Every detail was designed to make people believe they were stepping into some kind of private paradise. I watched all of this from a distance, standing on my porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. They were proud, confident, certain that the lake, the very thing they were selling, was theirs to market however they pleased. And they were right about one thing: the view was perfect. But the water was never theirs. That morning, before most people were awake, I drove to the far end of the lake. The road narrowed as it wound through a stretch of thick pines, and then the dam came into view, sturdy, weathered, and familiar. My grandfather's handiwork had held for over half a century. At the base of the dam, the water shimmered in the pale light. I parked, walked to the old metal gate, and slid the key into the lock. It was the same brass key my grandfather had carried on a leather cord in his pocket. The mechanism groaned as I turned it, the sound echoing across the still morning air. Slowly, I swung the gate open. The change was subtle at first, a rush of water spilling out into the channel, white foam churning where it hit the rocks below. But as the hours passed, the difference became impossible to ignore. By noon, the lake level had dropped nearly 4 feet. Shorelines stretched farther than they had in decades. Docks that had been floating now tilted, their far ends stuck in the mud. Boats sat stranded in shallow puddles. I didn't have to be there to know the panic was spreading. I imagined Victor, glass of champagne in hand, watching the waterline pull away from the cabin fronts he had promised would always have immediate lake access. I imagined buyers demanding answers, real estate agents scrambling to explain. By sunset, the perfect image they'd been selling all summer had crumbled. The lake was a shadow of itself, its muddy bottom exposed in wide swaths. The glitter was gone, replaced by the harsh reality that without the water, Lake Mirage was just a cluster of overpriced cabins in the middle of nowhere. And the one person who could change that was me. The next morning, the storm hit, not the kind that comes with rain and thunder, but the kind carried in the form of lawyers, angry phone calls, and threats shouted across driveways. The HOA moved fast. By sunrise, Victor was on my property, flanked by 2 men in tailored suits and polished shoes, waving legal papers like they were swords. They accused me of willful destruction of community assets and sabotage of private property. Their voices carried the smug certainty of people used to getting their way. I let them finish their little performance before I pulled out my own folder, the original deed to the dam, the registered water rights from 1964, and the maintenance records signed by every generation of my family since it was built. I didn't shout, didn't get emotional. I simply laid the papers on the hood of Victor's SUV and told them to read carefully. The silence that followed was almost as satisfying as opening the gate. The truth was simple. The lake existed because my family allowed it to exist. The dam was ours, the water was ours, and the rights to control both were legally airtight. Everything they had built depended on something they had no authority over. The HOA's lawyers flipped through the pages, their eyes darting from one clause to another. I could see the realization sinking in. They had no case. By the end of the week, the fallout began. Buyers who had put down deposits started demanding refunds when they realized their lakefront paradise might not have a lake at all. The banks that financed the development started calling in their loans. Contractors pulled out when payments stopped coming. The glossy Lake Mirage marketing campaign vanished from the internet almost overnight. Victor tried to keep up appearances, but the pressure broke him. First came the emergency HOA meetings, then the whispers about missing funds, and finally his quiet resignation. No farewell speech, no public explanation, just gone. The developer declared bankruptcy within a month, leaving half-finished cabins standing like skeletons along the dry shoreline. I didn't rush to refill the lake. For a while, I let the water level stay low, watching as grass and wildflowers began to creep into places that had been underwater for decades. Deer wandered across the exposed ground, and herons picked through the shallows. The quiet returned, slowly but surely, like an old friend finding their way home. When I finally did close the gate and let the water rise again, I made one thing clear to the remaining neighbors: this lake would never again be a bargaining chip for anyone's profit. It was a place to live, to fish, to watch the seasons change, not a backdrop for someone else's sales pitch. Looking back, it wasn't just about protecting the water. It was about protecting the idea that some things can't be bought, bullied, or built over. And if the HOA learned anything from the wreckage they left behind, it was this: owning the view means nothing if you don't own what's holding it together.